Hi, we're back with Mindrolling, and I'm Raghu, and I'm back with Mark Epstein, a new friend who's not really new because we have so many mutual close friends. It's not even funny, right, Mark?
Been around for a long time.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm happy to have you here, and we're going to be talking about Mark's new book, Advice Not Given: A Guide to Getting Over Yourself. And I don't know how many times I've used a similar aphorism actually with people who get really stuck. Can you just ignore yourself here for a little bit? You know what I mean? And so when I saw Get Over Yourself, I loved the title, Mark. I
You
loved
love the
it.
title? I'm
Yeah,
glad.
yeah, it's
I'm
really
glad.
great. Really great. So one of our very close mutual friends for both of us, and I kind of knew because I know you've spent a lot of time with Sharon and Joseph and Jack, who are part of the Be Here Now network, podcasters. And but it took me reading the book to really get an idea of just how close you are to Sharon, and she has, and I feel the same and am the same, and she's been an incredible teacher for me as well as a really good friend. And of course, we spend time every year because she comes out to Maui and she's close to Ram Dass and Krishna Das, and we have these retreats, and as you know, and so I, in reading some of the stuff your publicist sent as well, there was one particular quote that really caught me, and that was from Bob Thurman, another friend, um, and he termed the book "A True Treasure of a Guide to Being Real." And I
Mhm.
read that and I went, Jesus, that's really good timing because some time ago, a good friend of ours who does podcasts named Duncan Trussell, uh, he said to Sharon in one of these sessions we had out in Maui at the retreat, Sharon, what do you do for your practice? And Sharon said, I get up, I sit down on my mat, and I get real, Duncan. And you know that,
Good for Sharon.
yeah. And I don't know how many, I've been talking to a lot of our mutual friends from, all of our Vipassana friends and Bob and everybody, and everyone goes, God, I don't know. She didn't say that to me. That's so excellent. And then that started me off on a conversation about what that really means. And then Sharon and I did something with a couple of people, Duncan and Ethan Nichtern and David Silver over at Deepak Chopra Theater a few months ago, and she got into it. And she said, "I think we need to call it getting real,
Mhm.
because it is a process." And and this book is very much, very very much along those lines. And I thought what Bob said is absolutely true. And in this interview, I read an interview you did, a beautiful interview. It was in the Times a month ago or so. Um, that you said the ego wants security and stability and coherence. It's rooted in the intellect, so it tells stories. It fastens on to the first stories that start to make sense, both positive and negative. And when I we Sharon and I talked about this, it was how what are we talking about getting real? And certainly starting point is the stories we tell ourselves. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Well, I think Sharon should do a book called Getting Real.
Yeah,
That would
I'm being
be
encouraging. Absolutely.
that would be so good from her. I used Sharon as a case study in this book
Mm.
around the chapter on right speech. Because I wanted to reinterpret all of the aspects of the Eightfold Path instead of the sort of classic portrayal of them. I tried to turn them inward a little bit. So I talked about right speech as the way we talk to ourselves, not just the way we talk to others. Conventionally, it's about not gossiping and not wasting your time talking about other people. But I wanted to make people aware of how weird the way we talk to ourselves can be. And Sharon wrote that, in faith. I'm very interested in the spiritual teachers writing personally,
Mm.
and they hardly ever do. I think Ram Dass was always a great master at using his personal foibles to illustrate spiritual lessons, and I was very influenced by that. Sharon, in her book Faith, is the most personal that she has ever been in her writing, where she talks about the early traumas of her childhood, how she was an 8-year-old, 9-year-old girl sitting in her ballerina outfit with her mother watching television when her mother started to bleed. And Sharon had to call a doctor, and her mother was rushed to the hospital, and she never saw her mother again. And she talks about the what she calls the ambient, opaque silence that surrounds her in the wake of that early traumatic experience, and how she started making up stories about what was wrong with her to explain all the losses. And Sharon's example is, intense, more intense than what most of us have experienced, but we all do that to some degree. So I was inspired by her story and tried to use it in my book for other people.
Yeah. No, it's a powerful story and a testament to who she is as a person right now. Never mind spiritual teacher, getting through and transforming tremendous suffering. I mean, just tremendous suffering. It's a beautiful part of the book, Mark, and I really love that part.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I had a little conversation with Ram Dass. I hadn't seen Ram Dass in 20 years, but I visited him last spring. I went to Maui and stayed for a couple of days with him. And we were driving to the beach one day to do his swimming. And they were playing in the car, they were playing a tape of him talking in the 70s before his stroke. And he was such a masterful storyteller, weaving his personal history in with the spiritual teachings. And I asked him, how did you learn to do that? Were you just improvising, or did you have a plan before you started talking? And he said, oh, I was just improvising. And I said, well, how did you learn how to do all that? He said, I used to listen to my father giving speeches raising money for Jewish charities.
I didn't know that. That's tremendous.
I thought that was great.
Yeah, really. And talk about who's really good at that too is Sharon, of course. I mean, it's phenomenal. I mean, I'll set her off on things. No idea. I'll say, Sharon, okay, let's talk about whatever, and she'll launch right into it as if she had known about it for a week and prepared notes and everything. Yeah, just tremendous stuff. And the other interesting thing that I found just in the get-go around it was really and touching, and I'd love for you to tell the story really around your father, because he was close to the end of his life, and you had felt that you had never ever really talked to him. And,
well, I had talked to him. I had talked to him about a lot of things, but
not that, yeah.
But not about the spiritual work, not about my interest in Buddhism or my deep involvement with meditation. And I actually told Ram Dass this story when I was visiting him. So, because I think it was the kernel of my new book. It's what prompted me, in retrospect, I think it's what prompted me to write the book. My father, at the age of 84, was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor, the same tumor that John McCain has and that Ted Kennedy passed away from. Only in my dad, it was in the non-dominant side of his brain that only affected balance and sense of direction. So cognitively, he was fine. And he was an academic physician, a scientist, a researcher. He was working in his lab at the hospital right up until the moment of his diagnosis. But he got lost driving home from work, the same 15-minute route that he'd taken for 30 years. And that was how they found the tumor. And by the time they found it, it had already progressed, and he knew and they knew there was not much to do about it. I knew that too. And my father knew that there was nothing much to do to treat the tumor. I knew there was nothing much to do. But I remember sitting in my office in New York. My father was in Boston. And I realized I had never really spoken to my father about what I maybe had learned from Buddhism, what I had learned from meditation, about what might happen when we die. And I thought, should I try to talk to him? He was always very supportive of my work, but never engaged in any kind of real conversation about it. I knew he wasn't interested. He was a scientific materialist who, believed that when you die, you just die and that's it. And you go into, some kind of void version of a deep sleep. Um, but I decided I would try to talk to him, and I called him up and I said, we've never really talked about this, but this is our chance. What do you think? And he said, sure, go ahead, tell me whatever you want. And I said, well, here's what I understand. And I tried to put it in plain non-Buddhist language. There's a place inside of us, a place inside of you that's always been the same. That's who you've always been. And when you were 20, when you were 40, when you were 60, when you were 80, if you closed your eyes and went there, you knew you were you. But if you tried to put your finger on that feeling, it would be hard to find because it's a kind of transparent feeling. But nevertheless, you know that you're you somehow in there. I said, what the Buddhists say is you can learn to relax your mind into that space and ride that out as the body deteriorates and disintegrates, and that you can take your consciousness out through that portal. And he was like, okay, darling, I'll try. And that was our last real conversation.
That's so great, really.
But I was happy about it.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. So just before the podcast, I was at my optometrist, and I drove up there, and there was a car with a decal that said, "Sit, ego, sit." I thought, wow, that's so great. And now from your book, I quote, "The most important events in our lives, from falling in love to giving birth to facing death, all require the ego to let go. Sit." This is not something the ego knows how to do. If it had a mind of its own, it would not see this as its mission, for sure. If it had a mind, but there is no reason for the untutored ego to hold sway over our lives. No reason for a permanently selfish agenda to be our bottom line. And this is in the introduction to the book, and I mean, to me, this is we have a lot of listeners, Mark, that are next generation, and they're maybe not so interested in the isms, Hinduism, Buddhism, any isms, but they certainly, as we all are interested in a little an understanding of who we truly are and a way to transform many of the obstacles with our minds, with our egos, with our emotions, and so on. Why don't you just elaborate on the possibilities therein? Certainly someone like you. Oh, geez, I haven't even introduced you. For God's sake, Mark is an incredible therapist, psychotherapist, psychiatrist in New York, and has been involved also in Buddhism. We just launched into how we have all these friends in common, like you all know that, and who we are and who he is. And Mark has written a number of books, and all of these will be available to you when you go to BeHereNowNetwork.com/mindrolling. We'll have it up in the show notes. And Mark has worked with incredible people over the years, and I just I said this in the beginning, but this book, Advice Not Given, it should be a keeper for anybody who's looking to find a perspective that is plain spoken about how we can deal with our basic neuroses, and uses the Eightfold Path, as he said. So, Jesus, sorry about that, Mark.
What? It's nice to be introduced in the middle of a conversation. I think that's great. The thing that's unusual about my background is that I found Buddhism, and in fact met Ram Dass very, very early in my own development. When I was just starting college, I took an introduction to world religion class by chance because I met someone who was taking the class, and I wanted to get to know her. Otherwise, I had no real interest in it. But
I can relate.
the
Yes.
the first semester of the course was all about Eastern religion, and that was my introduction to both Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism, actually. And I went from there very quickly. I met a friend of yours named Dan Goleman, who was then a graduate student teaching fellow in a psychology course I was taking. And he suggested that I go out to Naropa because he said friends of his were going to be teaching out there. It was the first summer at Naropa. And I met all the people you were talking about before, Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield and Sharon and Ramdas. It turned out one of my professors at Harvard was the person who had both hired and fired Ramdas, but David McClellan,
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
had stayed friendly with him. So
Mm.
very, very quickly, I was immersed in this world of mostly Westerners who had studied already in Asia. And it was only after 5, 6, 7 years of doing meditation retreats and traveling in Asia with them that I decided to go back and go to medical school with the idea of becoming a psychiatrist. So my learning about Western therapy was always done through the prism, through the lens of what I had learned about Eastern thought. And then since finishing all of that a long time ago, more than 30 years ago, I've
Mm.
worked as a therapist with a sense of, how can I integrate these two worlds, both of which I've learned so much about, in particular about how our egos or our defense mechanisms that we needed in order to protect ourselves as we grew up, how those defense mechanisms, how our own egos end up obstructing us, making a barrier between who we think we are and who we have always been. And so my work as a writer, as a therapist, and my own personal work as a student of Buddhism has been about re-educating myself so that I could make contact myself with that place inside of me and help other people make contact with that place inside of them.
Mm. Yeah, and certainly this is an outstanding contribution, this book, because that's very self-evident as you read this book.
Well,
Um,
I try to use myself as
yeah.
my main case study. My editors were always pressuring me to write about my patients, and I was always somewhat reluctant to do that because it meant kind of listening to what they were saying with an eye towards using it for my own purposes,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
which I do some of. But I decided kind of early to try to use what little bits of memory I had to reflect upon my own experience and to sort of like we talk about screen memories in therapy, like one little memory actually contains the seed of something very important. So I try through my writing to find whatever that was so important that was making me remember that actual little event,
Yeah.
and then to use that to illustrate some of what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And and there's a bunch talk about seeds. That's a good word because there's a bunch of seeds I just found throughout the book that really helped to illuminate stuff for myself. I mean, I found it very useful. And one of them here is people learn to make room for themselves, to be with uncomfortable emotional experiences in a more accepting way. They learn to make sense of their internal conflicts and unconscious motivations, to relax against the strain of the ego's perfectionism, but make room for themselves. I think that's a
Yeah.
great phrase. Talk about that for sure.
Yeah, well, that's coming a lot from my understanding of what sometimes doesn't go so well in early childhood,
Ah,
because infants and young children are filled with emotional experiences, as we know, but they're not developed enough to understand what it is that they're experiencing. So they have intense rage, intense love, intense erotic feelings, but without the parents there adequately, we say a good enough parental environment, without the parents there to kind of hold the feelings and reinterpret them for the child, um, then a lot of us end up uncomfortable with the more intense emotional experiences that we're capable of. We learn to sort of push the feelings down. That's what Sharon was talking about the ambient, opaque silence that surrounded her grief. Um, and a lot of people who are attracted to the spiritual pursuits are doing it in a way to damp those feelings down. Also, they're looking for other ways to actually hold themselves at bay. And a lot of my work has been to sort of counter that tendency that I saw in people when I was younger. That people, even very advanced meditators and so on, some of them are afraid of their deepest feelings. But I think there's a way to use the meditation to make them more tolerable, and
Mm-hmm.
and to grow through that process.
Right. And make room, make friends. Any of those
Yeah,
are.
yeah, into radical self-acceptance, because I think the capacity to love is intimately connected with our ability to hate. And
Mm,
if we're afraid of our aggressive, destructive, angry feelings, then we're usually blocked in some way around our love too.
mm, right. And I find also in speaking with people and doing what I do in my own work, people have this feeling that once they get on the path, the spiritual path, path of awakening, then that's it, and we're home free, and a lot of spiritual bypassing goes on at that point. But you say awakening does not make the ego disappear. It changes one's relationship to it. I think that's super, super important for everybody to understand. The balance of power shifts, but there's still work to do. Rather than being driven by selfish concerns, one finds it necessary to take personal responsibility for them. A great phrase. I mean, I we are a good example, meaning Ram Dass and Krishna Das and I and others that you know, that we're over in India with Neem Karoli Baba. And my first moment, one of the deepest connective things that happened inside myself that I may not have been able to put into words at that moment, but put in after, was okay, that's it, done. We're here. This is obviously the experience of the transformed being, is the example of that. And here we are, many decades later, slogging through it. And
Yeah,
and really, it's the relationship with the stuff. It's the reactivity that's changed. And I think that, you're highlighting this is really all through the book, actually. And I think that's really
yeah.
important. No.
Well, you were all super lucky to have that experience, because you did tap into something very real at the heart of your being. So you all have that memory and that faith. I tried to talk in the book about using the Eightfold Path as a guide to continually dealing with that protective, ego defensive armor that keeps us away from really living in that experience that you touched so long ago.
Yeah.
And I was helped in that. The writer Stephen Batchelor, who's another
Mm.
contemporary reinterpreter of Buddhism, he found in the Buddhist sutras many instances of Mara, the person who like the god or the devil or the projection of the Buddha's ego, who teased and tortured and played with the Buddha right up until the point of his enlightenment. Even after the Buddha was enlightened, Mara was still whispering in his ear, telling him, "Oh, just drop all this spiritual stuff. You could still you could be a ruler, a great ruler. You could be rich. Like these people don't understand you. Why are you wasting your time with them?" So even the Buddha was in dialogue with his ego after his awakening. And so if it was true for the Buddha, it's definitely true for us, because we're not even awakened yet. So,
Yeah.
so being willing to be real about the hold that our egos have over us is very important.
Yeah.
That cuts through the sort of false spiritual posturing that we sometimes see.
Yeah. And the first noble truth, I believe, is right view. Is it? Yeah.
First noble truth is suffering,
Suffering. I'm sorry.
or
The first of the old.
unsatisfactoriness.
Yeah.
The first limb of the eightfold
Eightfold
path
path. Yeah.
is right view.
Yeah.
The
And
the eightfold path is divided into three parts. The first part is about conceptual understanding. It's about the way you think about things, and that's right view and right motivation. And the second part of the Eightfold Path is about how you behave. It's like an ethical set of principles, and that's right speech, right action, and right livelihood. And then only the third part is about meditation, and those are right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration.
yeah. And in right view, one of the things you pointed out was it was the Buddha's way of proposing something as a way of encouraging people to be realistic about themselves and the nature of things. And is that not the first step forward that one needs to take? Is that, and having the right perspective that isn't coming from your identity, mind, roles, emotions, or whatever. Right view asks us to focus on the incontrovertible truth of impermanence. It's a big word. Rather than trying to shore up a flawed and insecure self. And here we get to the core, and I've discussed this on many podcasts with many teachers around, and impermanence is a scary word for absolutely everybody at one point or another, or it's a very freeing word. I mean, in fact, I was just we're putting together. We have a retreat coming up with Ram Dass and Roshi Joan Halifax and Frank Ostaseski and Robert Thurman, and Bob's coming as well, around I thought it'd be great for it to be around Thich Nhat Hanh's thing, no death, no fear, and to really investigate that. And one of the things was the realization of impermanence. It transforms into love, which was a really there's a a complex concept, but impermanence and the realization of it again is throughout your book here, and as I say, it's a especially for people just waking up through whatever means, through meditation, through psychedelics, through a book, through a teacher, whatever. That does come in an immediate way. The idea, because we experience it, all of us, every day. Everything changes every moment, all the time, and there's resistance against that. And so, talk about right view and our resistance to accepting impermanence.
Well, they say in Buddhism that if you try to meditate without an idea of what the target is, it's like a blind man shooting arrows, not knowing where the target is at all. So the reason that the right view, right motivation comes first in the Eightfold Path is that you have to kind of set your conceptual understanding so you know why you're doing this sort of ridiculous thing of sitting and doing nothing when you're meditating. Like what are we looking at when we're meditating? What should we be focusing our mind on? It's more than just the breath or the mantra or whatever. So in Buddhism and Buddhist psychology, they say there are three marks of existence, three principles of existence. The first one is impermanence. The second one is they call egolessness, which no one understands. And the third one is suffering or unsatisfactoriness. So I focused in the book on impermanence because it's the easiest one to understand. It's very hard to argue with impermanence. If I tried to talk about egolessness, everyone would just get confused. But impermanence, we know, we can feel it in our lives. We can feel it in our loved ones, where if two people love each other, they're fated, one of them to lose the other at some point. We can feel it in our bodies as we age. We can feel it moment to moment. We can feel it, when the boiler breaks down and when our car gets stuck. There are so many variations on it. So we have an inherent tendency to resist the truth, the realistic truth of impermanence. The ego, as you quoted me earlier, the ego wants stability and security. It wants coherence. So the ego is all about, like, no, I don't want this. Give me some peace here. And the Buddhist thing is about, in right view, is stop fighting with it so much. This is a reality. There is a way to surrender to it. If you can learn what to do with your mind in the face of impermanence, then you've got a leg up.
Yeah. And there's a beautiful story here in the book, and it's in the Right View chapter. And it's about your wife and her best friend who got ill, cancer. And do you mind telling this story related to Joseph and
No, sure. Just really at the beginning of our relationship, right after we were married, my wife's best friend came down with a very rare and untreatable form of cancer, and she was clearly going downhill. And I was already close with Joseph, had done a number of retreats with him, traveled with him in India, but my wife didn't know him very well. He came to visit. She poured her heart out to him about what was happening with her friend. She trusted him because I did. And he said something on the order of, stop making such a big deal about it. He said it very kindly, and when we told him about it like 30 years later, he was sort of aghast that he had actually said something like that. Because it doesn't, when you tell the story or when you read it on the page, it can come through as sort of cold, and like a Buddhist teacher who's like, oh, well, this is all just already broken, but he said it very kindly, and it really touched her. In some way, it made her see, I think, that she was making this inevitable change about her, more about her than about her friend. And it just like zeroed right in on something in her, and she let go of that extra quality that she was putting on the experience. And that left her actually more available to her friend, and curiously more available to herself. So she said she went into her, she's a sculptor, my wife. She said she went into her studio after that conversation, and she put everything away that she was working on, and she started fresh, just working with wet plaster, which when it's wet, it's very moldable, but it dries very fast. So she had just a very short time to work with the plaster. It was like a metaphor for life. And she just started messing with it. And out of her messing with it, she started to see this like Buddha-like form started to emerge. She said if she looked at it one way, it would just look like a pile of shit on the sidewalk. But looked at from over here, it started to look like a Buddha. And she decided to give one to me. And there's one on the cover of the book. So she ended up making about, yes, exactly. She ended up making several hundred of them over a period, several year period, and they provided her with that kind of comfort. She had never made any kind of realistic or iconic work before, and it was sort of an anomaly in her career. But it holds something of that first conversation with Joseph and of her love for her friend.
Yeah, and it's a very common thing when we have that kind of trauma with people around us or ourselves, of that extra, I forget what you just called it, extra something that we throw in there that has nothing to do with, we just pile it in there. In fact, to me, it's similar. I find like anger is something I deal with. And I find if something happens, here we're going to have a little therapy session.
Yeah, come on, anger.
I find that when I get, and I've talked about this before on podcasts, when I get, if something triggers me and I lose it, if I find there's a point at which okay, I'm going to go for it now. Fuck it. I'm just letting go into this. And it goes way beyond what that particular incident might have been. It gets pulled from the deepest, darkest recesses of my emotional makeup and mind, and everything gets thrown in there, and it gets magnified 100 times from whatever the wrong I might have felt, that triggered this thing. So to me, that happens, and I see that with people too, with around grief especially. There's that extra something that gets thrown in there that has nothing directly to do with the situation that triggered the grief, anger, and so on. Is that not
Well,
true?
except it might actually have a lot to do with what triggered the feeling, because the intensity of that rage that comes over you is actually intimately connected with your true self. It's just it's going in the wrong direction. We talk in the psychotherapy world about the ruthlessness of an infant's desire, the ruthlessness that manifests as anger, thwarted desire actually becomes has the flavor of losing it that you're talking about. So whatever the little event is that triggered you, in your present day incarnation, might actually be pulling from a much earlier time when the authentic infant you was trying to get his needs met and crying out, indiscriminately. So if you can turn your mind, if you can pay attention to the intensity of the affect, of the feeling that's coming over you at that moment, instead of directing it outward at the perceived threat, if you can turn your awareness, like you know how to do, back on the intensity of that feeling, it might do something.
I'm going to have
helpful.
to might have to investigate this a little further with you
Okay.
when I'm in New York, okay?
You can investigate it further in yourself.
Yes, I'll start there. In right motivation, and this is everybody, listen to this out there, okay? You can see I'm getting something here. I think everybody can. We do not have to be at the mercy of our neuroses if we do not want to be. The conscious mind, when properly oriented, of course, that's a big thing. When properly oriented, you'll have to talk about that, can, with practice, rise above the conditioning of its subconscious influences and intentionally direct a person's activity. Habitual and repetitive patterns of reactivity dominate the untrained mind. There's some big stuff in there, though, in terms of...
Well, the book is actually easier to read than you're making it seem, but...
No. But we don't have to be the mercy of our neuroses.
Well, we're all at the mercy of our neuroses. Yeah. We all are most of the time.
Yeah.
But the idea that we don't have to be all of the time, or that there's the potential, as I was saying to you a minute ago, even when we're most clearly at the mercy of our neuroses, and we're ignoring everything we've learned in our entire lives because we've lost it in that moment. Even then, there's the possibility of turning our awareness back on ourselves and learning from the experience. But it's all about being willing to, I think, tolerate the feelings that are forcing us to act out. Instead of acting out, we can learn to use those exact moments to train our minds.
And I think that's when you, as part of this, when properly oriented, the conscious mind, when properly oriented.
Yeah.
What are we talking about, properly oriented?
Well,
are we talking about practices?
No, it has to do with, like, what's the real point of meditation? At least from the Buddhist point of view, the real point of meditation is to find the self that we take to be so real that the Buddha said is an illusion. That's the experience of emptiness that is so valorized in Buddhism. So how do we find the feeling of self, that the Buddha says is unreal? We have to look for where we experience it as most real. When do you feel yourself to be most real? And so the one of the things I love about Buddhist psychology, and Robert Thurman was the first one to tell me about this, is that one of the times that the self reveals itself to you is when someone you love uh, um, does something to hurt your feelings. When someone you love experiences you as having done something that irritates them, and they get angry with you, and you have the feeling like, I didn't say that, I didn't do that. How can she be thinking this of me? That's where there's the self. I didn't do that. How could she think that of me? How could he treat me that way? So instead of reacting, as we all do, but those are opportunities, even like looking for a parking space in New York and someone steals the parking space from you, like what? Um, those are moments when the self that doesn't exist reveals itself, most clearly as something that we think does exist. So the trained mind, the tutored mind, knows, oh, what a great opportunity. My best friend is accusing me of being a jerk. So I can use that. I can use that to divest myself a little bit of this core feeling of, well, I'm really somebody, who needs to be taken seriously, kind of thing.
Righteousness. Got to
Right.
let
Yes,
go a
that's good.
little bit
That's
of
the,
righteousness,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. Mm. Right speech. Okay, this thing. It's not like I'm going to go through all of the Eightfold Path here, everybody, but because this is a huge subject. But Mark, this
Yeah.
thing in right speech.
Right speech.
I loved it. It's something if I took away, if you said, okay, what was the one big thing I mean, there's a lot of things to take away in this book. How we talk to ourselves
Yeah.
is as important as how we speak to others is a huge takeaway. Now, everybody who's listening now, just walk away from this podcast and then keep in mind as a mindfulness exercise just the awareness of the self-talk that you are doing as you walk around the day, and just look at in my case, and I'll have to start with something that you know people maybe get bored of hearing, and we're all bored of hearing it because we want, if anything, we watch the news or we see social media or whatever. But when our current president's name comes up, I have a bunch of self-talk. Some of it's talking right at the TV if I happen to have it on, and it's all negative. And after, and as I was reading the book, and this came up, and mindful of what is going on. I'm a fairly mindful person, and I saw the intensity of forget what I'm saying to people, and we conspire together by virtue of, oh God, we got to get rid of this thing that's out there. What can we do, and what actions can we take? And aside from all of that, the internal dialogue that is negative, and around, that's just a really transparent example. But the self-talk that embroils us further into the unconscious self that you just talked about is extraordinary. And yeah, I guess it's a big takeaway.
Well,
I got to it.
we're all talking to ourselves all the time.
Yeah,
That's the thing.
yeah,
So to become aware of that, usually it's subliminal, and we take those thoughts as, oh, that they're just there. People go on a meditation retreat and they're meditating in the meditation hall, and then they go to their rooms and close the door, and then they're talking to themselves again. Like that. So to be able to acknowledge that and pay attention to the flavor of those thoughts. About half of us have intensely negative flavor to most of those thoughts, and the other half of us are usually criticizing other people If we're not criticizing ourselves, we're criticizing other people.
Mm.
So, to make use of that time, to make use of that fact, to get a sense of, oh, look how we're propping ourselves up in this way all the time, all the time. We're thinking the same kinds of thoughts over and over and over again, hardly ever having an original thought. And it's a mistake to think that the thinking goes away from spiritual practice. Thinking is in Buddhist psychology, one of the five skandhas. It's there all the time. You don't get rid of it. Like the ego, you don't get rid of it. But by paying attention to the texture of it, to the flavor of it, you actually can start to see it shift. And just the awareness to it by itself helps to bring that shift about.
Hmm. Yeah. I love your little phrase, the stories we tell ourselves, we repeat under our breath.
Under our breath.
Our
Yep.
breath. Yeah.
Yep. Muttering to ourselves. Yep. Yeah. Well, there's a remnant of who you were as like a 11-year-old or an 8-year-old. I don't know if you have siblings, but
Yeah.
the way your siblings treated you, or the way you were thinking about how you were treating them, or there's a remnant of that childhood, adolescent self in all of us that comes out in our most private thoughts. And that can manifest around drugs, it can manifest around sex, it can manifest around any kind of addictive tendencies that we have. So it's worth paying attention to.
Yeah. And you do say here, and I think this is another great offering from you, from the book, a person has to show up before their internal monologues can be unpacked and questioned. And,
yeah. Well, that was from Sharon again. That was someone asked Sharon, what's the most important thing in therapy? And they thought, it was another psychiatrist, they thought love was the central healing element. And Sharon was like, no, I think just showing up for their appointments is really the core thing. So I took that, and showing up for yourself, that the sense of being real that we started out talking about.
Right.
I'm going to sit down and be real with myself now.
Yeah. The thread through this whole book, and
yeah,
it's been a thread through my last 2 months of talking to all of our mutual friends here about this very subject. And another in the Right Action chapter, another to me extraordinarily important point for us all to take to heart is letting go, and it has more to do, you say, with patience than it does with release. I think we need to talk about that, because you can't walk one foot in front of the other without both of those things.
Well, I was trying in that little bit, I was trying to counter the sort of naive notion that letting go of our difficult emotions means that we just release them. That, oh, I'm angry at someone, oh, I can just let go of my anger and it goes away, kind of thing. And that feels impossible to me. I don't think it works that way. So I was trying to find words for, well, what is the experience of letting go? And I think it's more about tolerance or patience with oneself, so that instead of being totally attached, I guess we would say, to whatever our immediate feelings are, we can hold it in slight remove, so that we don't have to be pushed around in the way that you were describing earlier, happens to you at your most difficult moments.
Yeah. Patience. Yeah. Jack Kornfield does a great thing in many of his talks. It's a recurrent theme. We're human. It's okay.
That sounds like Jack.
Yeah. It's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that made me think of that when I was reading this around patience, because we get so on top of ourselves and self-judging so much of the time there's no space left to allow for whatever to even transform and not have such a grip on us. So yeah, to me, the patience is okay. We're human, This stuff
Yeah.
is going to go
Well,
on.
I told this story in the book about traveling some years ago on my book tour, and I was picked up by a young woman who was going to drive me from the airport, and she had a teacher who had come out of a 3-year Buddhist retreat, but he had developed colon cancer while he was on the retreat, and when he came out of the retreat, he was close to death, and he came and lived with this woman. She took care of him until he died, but she told me his last dying words were, "No, no, no, help, help."
Mm.
And she was like so upset that he was a very advanced practitioner. Why should his last words have been so fearful? And I think this idea of patience comes in even there, that we have this idea that if we've done our spiritual work, we're supposed to be able to die easily, like we're supposed to be able to do everything else easily. And maybe we're expecting too much in this one lifetime, or maybe dying actually is uh, scary and painful, at least as we're going into it. So to put the judgments aside and the idealizations aside, and instead to be real with whatever the experience is. And for her, it was to be real with this, beloved person's experience, instead of resisting what he revealed to her, at the time of his death. There's some kind of patience necessary there too,
Yeah.
even in not knowing what the lesson was.
Right. Right. And that another thing also that you talk about in the book, getting comfortable with not knowing,
Yeah.
and yeah, that's also it falls in line with patience and spaciousness and allowing things to be, is being comfortable.
Yeah, it falls in line with like we're just these human beings, and how did we get here, and what are we doing here,
Yeah.
and what's it all about?
Right.
Um, so we turn
Uh,
to people like Ramdas to tell us, and
yeah. Yeah. Well, when we were, I mean, it just makes me think when you say, "What's it all about?" And my first experience of Neem Karoli Baba was to see somebody. There was no I in there. There was no he never. There was no relating from me and you, or us and them, or no polarity anymore. There was just a
mm,
pool of whatever, and that thing was doing whatever was necessarily the right thing to do for everybody, including just giving somebody a chapati.
mm,
They needed food. They didn't need anything else. They didn't need any spiritual counseling. And of course, all the way to the other side where people ask for, oh, I need to get married. My son needs a job. That's what they do in India with gurus. All the way to us, which was a whole other realm of what we needed in that time. So the beauty of service was so transparent for us in those moments, which is why Ramdas talks only of these days. What I only know 3 things. He told me, or 2 main things: love everyone and tell the truth, and serve and remember, and that's it. So yeah, we were really fortunate to have that example so early on. But here I am, and I'm still ready to jump all over somebody if if
well, watch how you say it.
yeah, right. Right effort. Just there's a couple of things here before we leave you. Um, I think that's something we should mention, because there is we in the West have such a penchant for, we're going to do this, and we're going to be the best at it, and we're going to get it done as quickly as possible, and we're going to put everything we have into make this better than anybody else has before. And so I think, especially around meditation, there's a lot of preconceived notions, especially with people just getting into it, about what that represents, and there's going to be a real will used to get from point A to point B.
Well, you see
Right effort.
both. We have in terms of effort. I agree. In the West, there's this striving, intense striving, and want to get it done, and then at the same time, there's a really profound laziness. So people, people
Relating.
know they know what the path is, but they don't really do it necessarily. Because to really do it means to sit down and spend time being honest with themselves about themselves. And there's a big tendency to evade that. So that's what's beautiful about the Buddhist path is he's always like, well, a little too much on this direction, you're just going to get more anxious. And a little bit, too much in the other direction, and you're just going to be like wasting your time. So the middle path is actually, keeping the effort tuned. They use the example of tuning an instrument. So if the strings are too taut, it makes a brittle sound. If they're too loose, it's just flabby. So you have to keep yourself tuned properly. And what does that mean? And what that means is something that each person has to discover for themselves. So that's the rightness of all of these things. Right speech, right effort doesn't mean that there's wrong speech and wrong effort necessarily, but that the rightness involves a kind of balance. That's more the meaning of whatever the Sanskrit word was originally.
Yeah. Middle path. Yeah.
And something tuned to the correct frequency. It's like tuning your mind to the correct frequency.
Yeah. We used to get a lot of that when we first learned how to play Indian instruments, especially the tambura.
Oh, I bet.
You'd spend hours tuning this thing and it's a great example of the patience and spaciousness and effort.
Well, the same thing with the mind. That's all coming out of that same South Asian tradition where you spend a lifetime learning how to tune the instrument. In order to play the classics.
Yeah, great analogy, really. There's just a couple of there's a great thing in the epilogue actually, and you quote Suzuki Roshi, who was, by the way, everybody out there, if you do not know Suzuki Roshi, back in the day he was certainly for us one of the first wake-up calls.
Great masters.
About the Easter. Yeah.
Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. That's the great book.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Read one little page at a time.
Yeah. Anyhow, you're describing the relief that comes from getting over yourself. Again, I just love that expression. He used the expression mind waves to describe the turmoil of the ego's struggle with everyday life. Waves, he would always insist, are part of the ocean. If you are trying to find the peace of the ocean by eliminating the waves, you will never succeed. But if you learn to see the waves as part of the whole, to not be bothered by the ego's endless fluctuations, your sense of yourself as cut off, separate, less than, or unworthy will shift. That's a beautiful thing in itself from him, huh?
Yeah. Well, I felt like he was talking directly to me. That's why I
that's
why I put it in the epilogue.
That's so great. But above all things, and you've mentioned and we've talked a little bit throughout this conversation, really getting down to, okay, why? What is this? We're looking, we're self-inquiry, we're finding who we truly are, and we're letting that come to the fore, shall we say? And here's something that I think is the core of it, and it's you say every aspect of the Eightfold Path is a counterweight to selfish preoccupation. The Buddhist reprieve is accomplished not by leapfrogging over the ego's needs or demands, but by zeroing in on them, acknowledging and accepting them, while learning to hold them with a lighter, more questioning, and more forgiving touch. That is a crucial thing for all of us in this life to embody that, Mark? I mean, I
Well,
really.
I think there's a simpler way of saying it actually, which is that there's a path of fear or there's a path of love, and we all tend towards the path of fear, but that's where the ego is. So by paying attention to that, to how much that's motivating us, we actually can find our way to the path of love, which is where we want to be.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
where we truly are, once we.
it's where we're coming from,
Yeah, it's
and
where
where
we're
we're
from.
going back
Yeah,
to. So might as well
exactly.
be here now.
Yeah. Perfect. What a perfect ending. Advice not given, a guide to getting over yourself. And I can't more highly recommend this book to us all, really. Mark, wonderful offering. Really
Thanks,
is.
Raghu. Thanks so
Uh,
much.
yeah. And everybody, you'll get a link to be able to get the book, Mindrolling. You go to BeHereNowNetwork.com/mindrolling, and you'll see the show notes and the books. And we'll put in Suzuki Roshi's book as well, and Sharon, and everything that's near and dear to Mark will be available there. And Mark, if people want to get to your website.
Yeah. There's a website. They're it's right there for them. Mark Epstein, MD, I think.
Yeah, .com.
.com. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you can do that, and
And
if
there's
you're.
a Facebook page. I have a
Oh, you
pretty
do.
up to date Facebook page, which is also Mark Epstein, MD. And
Okay. Great.
I did a conversation the other night at the Rubin with a psychic medium that I told Ram Dass about, named Laura Lynn Jackson, who's wonderful. And they streamed not the questions, but the conversation it's there on my Facebook page also.
Oh, really? I'm going to
Yeah.
go there. Somebody
Yeah.
mentioned this to me. Laura Lynn Jackson.
Yeah. Yeah. She has a beautiful book herself
Oh, really?
called The
Okay.
Light Between Us. But the conversation, I think people were really touched by the conversation. I was.
Oh, beautiful. You'll have to introduce me to her so I can have a chat with her too.
Good.
Anyhow, thank you very much, though, really, for being here, Mark.
Good. Thanks a lot.
And I've been wanted to do this for quite some time, and I'm happy you're here. And let's do it again one of
Great.
these days.
Great. I'll
And
look forward to it.
yes, great.
Okay. See you around.